we're filming, right?
Yes, we are recording.
Okay.
Welcome, everybody.
Welcome, everyone. My name's John. This is my friend Davood Gozli. Davood, would you like to say a few opening words about how we decided on this book?
Yeah, I found John's YouTube channel. I enjoyed your critique, your reviews and criticism, and we started talking in the comment sections first, and then we considered the idea of reading a book together slowly. Since we are both busy, we are reading one chapter at a time. So if any of the viewers likes to join us, it will be very easy to just jump in and read a chapter, sample a chapter. And so it sounds like a very, go ahead.
I'm going to leave a message underneath the drop-down box, inviting other people to, if they're curious about this talk, or maybe future ones that we have, to express interest to either you or me and let us know, and then maybe they can take part in future ones as they wish.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
The book that we decided on was, and let's see if this, is that, there we go. It's Hayden White. Hayden White was a literary critic, I guess you could call him, but he had, was interested in a lot of different questions that reached beyond literature, especially into history. History, the study of genres, and stuff like that. And this book is a set of essays. We are discussing on perhaps how to pronounce that first word. I don't know if we made a final decision. It could be tropics, but it also could be tropics.
I'm convinced that it is tropics.
Study of tropes.
Yeah.
Are you convinced? Okay. We can go with that. So this is Tropics of Discourse, essays on cultural criticism, essays in cultural criticism. It has an introductory essay, which is what we'll be talking about today, followed up by, I think, 12 essays which sort of tie into the ideas in the introductory essay. And all we're going to be talking about today is the introduction, because there's a lot to sort of chew on there, and it's plenty to talk about, and we'll give context for however many of these we want to do.
Yeah.
So maybe some vocabulary to start out with.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
It's a very sort of idiosyncratic way of writing. It's not so idiosyncratic when you talk about literary criticism generally, because a lot of it is like this. But he's very much in love with his words from the history of rhetoric. He borrows a lot from some philosophical vocabulary, and he's not the easiest writer to understand for people who haven't really delved into theory. But Davood and I think, want to sort of make this more approachable, because I don't think it has to be as hard as the way he's writing it.
Right.
So what would you like to say about maybe some important words, big words that reoccur over again?
First, I just like to maybe read together this first sentence, the first two sentences of the chapter, which I found quite beautiful. And then we will get to the first keyword, or the central word of the introductory chapter, which is discourse, and what it is, and then the soul of discourse. So if you don't mind, I'll read the first two sentences. When we seek to make sense of such problematical topics as human nature, culture, society, and history, we never say precisely what we wish to say or mean precisely what we say. So we never say what we precisely wish to say, and we never mean what we are precisely saying. Our discourse always tends to slip away from our data towards the structures of our of consciousness with which we are trying to grasp them. So this is almost like how Kant begins the first critique.
And he'll come back to that at the very end, right? And that whole structures of consciousness is exactly what clued me into he might be some sort of a Kantian here. And lo and behold, at the very end, he says it himself. And we'll go into what makes him a Kantian later, in case you're not familiar with Kant. Um, discourse, to build
Discourse.
on that. Discourse, he defines it as the verbal operation by which the questing consciousness situates its own efforts to bring a problematical domain of experience under cognitive control.
Mm.
So basically, you can see how he writes. He loves the sound of his own voice. He's talking about a conversation. He's talking about a conversation about a topic. So when we talk about history, we're having a discourse. We're having a conversation. We're having some sort of back and forth, a give and take. He doesn't like the word dialectic, but we could say it is some sort of a dialectical process, right?
Right. And he offers another alternative to dialectic, which is diatectic. So tactic or taxis is a movement, so moving from one place to another. And
Yes.
Diataxis, I think he wants to suggest that it's movement in time. You go from the structure of your consciousness to the subject at hand, the subject matter, and then you go back and forth because of that slipping away of the object.
He says he doesn't like the word dialectical because dialectic often refers to something transcendent. Again, there's that Kantian strain again. But there's nothing really obviously transcendent when we're talking about human conversations, right? Whether it be about history or anything else. So that move from dialectical to diatactical was, again, just another expression of his love for rhetorical terms, I think, and kind of unnecessary. I think dialectical would have been fine, but I understand where he's coming from. So discourse is basically a conversation between at least two people on undergoing the process of understanding, trying to approach some sort of understanding on a subject.
It might be useful. He contrasts discourse with two other things. He says discourse is neither just a logical demonstration nor fiction. So what is characteristic of both? Well, in logical demonstration, language can afford to just refer to itself. So deduce based on what is already within statements, just preserve the truth of statements without having to refer to something beyond language, something in the world, an event in the world, or a fact in the world. And fiction also, whatever fiction refers to, doesn't have to be faithful to events in the world. It can just be products of language. But discourse cannot afford that. Discourse always has that diatactic or dialectic relationship with something. And that is the root of its difficulty.
Fiction can be a complete fabrication.
Right.
It's not tied to anything of the external world. It can be a complete artifice. Fact is something that I think Hayden White would question that we have any access to whatsoever. We really have no access to raw facts. Again, that's Kant. We'll talk about that later. So then what is discourse? Discourse is a mapping, a series of mappings from those raw facts, which we claim to have some sort of access to our attempt of creating some sort of understanding. And how we do that is through the imposition of tropes.
Right. Which is why he says tropes or troping is the soul of discourse.
Yes.
Soul
there
as
would be
opposed to
without the other. There would be no discourse without tropes.
Right. Well, the soul as opposed to the body. The discourse will have just a dead body without the
yes.
without tropes.
That's Descartes. We don't need to go into Descartes and Kant.
Right.
But yes. So these tropes he is particularly concerned with four, and he sort of refers to these, I think, as master tropes. The four tropes are metaphor, metonymy, synecdoche, and irony. I think everyone probably knows what metaphor and irony are. Synecdoche and metonymy, I always get confused But I mean, you can look them up in a dictionary. I always have to, but they basically have to refer to calling something by its part or by its whole or something. They're very related, but I always have to look them up myself. So he's saying that these are four ways that we can take raw pieces of data, raw facts, and try to understand them.
Would you agree that what is common in all these four, would you agree that they all are ways of grasping something that is beyond our grasp initially? Like
Yes.
Metaphor, metonymy, irony, they're all things, they're ways of grasping something. Metonymy is grasping something by one of its parts. Synecdoche is, or no, it's a switching. Metonymy, as you said, I switched between them. And metonymy is a way of switching something else that is adjacent. Synecdoche is a way of grasping something by its part. And irony is a way of being in relationship with it through that distance. And metaphor is basically a kind of using something else that we are familiar with in order to grasp the thing that we are unfamiliar with. So these are all ways of grasping, which enables discourse.
And to go back to those first two sentences that you read, I want to quote the exact language that he uses. He talks about structures of consciousness. Mm-hmm. Structures of consciousness. I think what he's almost saying is that human understanding can't really occur without these four things. I mean, this is how these four things, and other rhetorical tropes too, but these four things are four of the major ways that our mind slowly goes from no understanding to understanding.
Right.
And that travel, again, that sort of slow path from one to the other, not understanding to understanding, is the process of a discourse. Mm. We impose these things. These are the tools that we have to sort of make our way through the world. Mm-hmm. When we ask ourselves questions and attempt to understand answers to those questions. Mm.
So when somebody, for example, calls something a hard fact, or a fact that doesn't care about my feeling, the hardness of that fact is itself a metaphor. Like you're comparing metaphor to a hard rock that doesn't budge, is not sensitive to, has no sensation or sensitivity or responsiveness to my feelings. That itself, that statement is a product of a metaphor, and it is serving a kind of human function.
It serves an ideological function too.
Right.
Because by using the word hard, you are imbuing the adjectives of strength, something you can't fight with, something that doesn't back down, mm-hmm. something that is always true, as opposed to soft, which is something that sways, something that oscillates, something that's easy to destroy, right?
Yeah, something that you can negotiate with, maybe.
But by the choice of adjectives, have we employed a trope, mm-hmm. which starts to do battle mm-hmm. with the way that we come to understand or not understand something. Mm-hmm. The way I was thinking about it was the famous Civil War photographers of the American Civil War. And this might be an overly simplified example, but you look at a lot of those photographs and they are understandably gory, full of death and blood and destruction. And then there are others that are oddly peaceful, right? Just a battlefield after it's been cleared. And I was thinking about a trope might be the choice of where the photographer sits or stands when he chooses to, or she chooses to take that photograph. Mm-hmm. Because from this valley, you might see certain things that you wouldn't see from the top of this hill or from this position over here. And someone could get two very different pictures of what was going on in a battle or the kind of carnage that had passed when you take two different pictures. That might be another example.
That's a great example.
I don't know which of the four that would be. That might be a completely different one, but that was the one that was always sort of going through my head when I was reading the essay.
But what it does is, that's a great example because it shows how the tropes that we use, the tropes themselves don't become the focus of our attention. The trope always hides in the background and presents the objects. The trope of the metaphor of a hard rock as the fact being a hard rock, that presents the statements about the fact and itself hides in the background, which is why we are required. I mean, it takes efforts to go back and analyze the tropes and uncover them. The location of the photographer also, the photographer and her or his location is hiding in the background. You have to like notice it and notice its role. Otherwise, what is presented to us, what is presented is the scene.
And I would go so far as to say that the more invisible a trope is, the more successful it is. Because if you really want to lose an argument or lose a point in an argument, you draw attention to the fact of how artificial your point is, right? You want to make that point seem natural. You want to make it seem like it's completely obvious. And the more you can hide the trope, the more you can easily fit it into the discourse or that narrative that makes it seem natural, easy, simple, undeniable. And maybe that's one of the reasons why you didn't have Matthew Brady, the famous Civil War photographer, standing in front of his camera doing this when he was taking pictures, because that's only a late 20th century thing, right? You want to hide the photographer. The whole point is to not show the person making the decisions, to show the, reality, how they want to show it to us, but to not have the person making the decisions in front of the camera, but to just have the battle scene there.
Great. So I think we covered the central theme of this introduction. Now, I assume he will be applying this idea to the study of history, how the study of history is not as objective as many readers or many historians might claim to be, that the use of tropes, the place of discourse persists throughout our doing and studying of history. But remaining with this chapter, there are maybe a few other things we can address, a few names that he drops, not references, that he makes references to a couple of psychologists, namely Jean Piaget.
You would go to the psychologist, wouldn't you?
Yeah. Because I think by the weirdness, by the strangeness of these references, I think he makes it in some ways more clear. He made it clear what he's doing, because you have to make the connection. You have to put some effort to make the connection yourself. It's like, what is the connection between tropes, Piaget, Freud, and then his examples from history? So maybe we can say a few things about the inclusion of Piaget. What is, for me, significant in that connection is that he wants to say that discourse is not something we only do in our scholarly activities. Discourse and these four tropes are features of our conscious activities. And anytime our awareness, our human consciousness is attempting to gain an understanding of something, in that process, these four ways are applied. We apply these four ways. And those show up in different stages of human development, the development of human mind.
It's exactly. It's not something that happens when you open up a textbook. It's always going on. When you don't understand how, something works, anything works, you are, first of all, trying to think about it in terms of how things work. That's a metaphor, for example. So that's sort of like the first step, and then you progress through the other steps. But it's not just history. It's not, and this is one of the things about genres. He'll eventually go on to say that we understand different kinds of genres through the tropes that are used in them.
Mm.
So history brings certain kinds of expectations to it. So, for example, history is usually, in a classical sense, told in chronological order, right? That's one of the things we expect of it. But that's not necessarily true of a novel.
Mm.
So, what are the other things that make history and a novel different genres? What tropes are allowed and disallowed into each one that make them contribute to genres that we recognize as being definitely history, definitely a novel, definitely an epic poem?
Do you want to talk about prefiguration? As he talks without defining, and I wanted to make sure my understanding is, kind of matches with yours. And Piaget helps me understand what he means by prefiguration. So with the help of Piaget, let's say a child is able to play a telephone. And so he's able to pick a toy telephone and just pretend that he's talking to the toy telephone. A next stage of in child development enables the child to now pick a fruit like a banana and pretend that it's a telephone. That's a stage of representation. You're like imagining something to be something else, applying the metaphor of a telephone to this banana. So he says that this act of pretending already prefigures in the use of the telephone. The use of the telephone, the activity of going back and forth, the physical movements, they all prefigure that next step of now using it a little bit more intentionally, a little bit more reflectively, to then apply to the banana.
Mm-hmm.
So this prefiguration is that the material for discourse is already present in the previous stage, and what we do with tropes, what they do is that they bring in a new application to the material that already prefigures the ability for the trope, something like that.
Yeah, I knew you would get more out of the Piaget section than I did.
Mm.
That was one of the parts that for me was, I read it 2 or 3 times, and I'm familiar with the stages and everything. Well, somewhat familiar with the stages. I mean, I had Psych 101 and everything, but his application to them, to the stages, seemed like I might need to be more familiar with them than I was. The thing about, he talks about Freud, right?
Mm-hmm.
The most obvious to see his examples sometimes are like needlessly abstruse. The Freud, he should have talked about the id, the ego, and the superego.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what better way to talk about a trope that everyone will recognize than those? But he talks about some, I don't know what he did. He didn't even mention those, I don't think.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah, he focused more on the process that Freud identified. So
in dream
yeah,
interpretation.
Yeah, which is very striking. That basically his claim is that process between what we see in our dream, the apparent dream material, and what is beneath them, the translation between that is also tropical. Is it something akin to discourse that
the
gets
latent
us
and the manifest?
Right. It gets us from the latent level to the manifest level. So that kind of like charged his idea of discourse, his ideas of tropes. Every time he added somebody else's idea to them, you kind of like thickened or enriched the value. It charged it with extra value, his tropes and his discourse idea.
There is, he alludes to it at the very end of the essay, how he's been accused of basically being some sort of, fancy pants postmodernist, right? Saying that facts don't exist. There's no reason to say that we can have access to history or historical knowledge. How do you think you would counter something like that? because he does say, in my next 12 essays, I do my, I trust that I have defended myself from that accusation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he defends himself enough in the introduction. How do you think? And if you don't have an answer, I'll give you my answer if you don't have anything to say about that.
If a couple of times, and when he talks about other people, he says, "Hey, I don't." Somebody might say that he just imposed his theoretical system on the data, and maybe so. Maybe it's half theoretical imposition, half determined by data. But that's not really his question. I think my impression is that he's concerned with something else, but I don't know how he would respond specifically to anti-realism.
There was a quote in here. Oh, yeah, I think it's at the very beginning again. Like everything important, he says. He's talking about that slipping away, slipping towards human consciousness, right? Our discourse always tends to slip away from our data towards the structures of human consciousness with which we are trying to grasp them. So I kind of wanted to explain what I meant by Kantian earlier, and that might give some insight as to what his defense would be from that accusation. So just like a 3-minute Kant refresher for those people who may not be familiar with Kant's big contribution to philosophy at the end of the 18th century. Kant is trying to mediate between two large philosophical traditions that preceded him, those of the empiricists and those of the rationalists. The rationalists say that the mind itself can conclude everything that we need to know about the world. And empiricists say that the mind itself knows nothing, and that we need experience. Our minds need to be written on by the world in order to have knowledge of it. And of course, the classic formulation of that would be John Locke's tabula rasa, right? The blank slate. Our mind is a blank slate. We know almost certain, at least as far as language acquisition now, that is simply not the case, but that's a much later discovery. Kant comes along and says that there's something inherent in our minds that when we look out into the world, we don't have direct access to the things that we perceive. And he makes this distinction. He calls raw factual data out there, quote unquote, inverted quotes. He calls them noumena, Noumena. Once we experience them, once they've been processed by our cognitive faculties, they have been transformed into phenomena. So he has this distinction between noumena and phenomena. Our minds are not these just sort of blank, receptive, bland interpreters of the world. They actively impose things on the world. Like, for example, Kant will say, when we look out in the world, there is no such thing, and Hume was famous for saying this, making this criticism. We can't tell cause from effect. I mean, you see two bowling balls, one hits the other and the other one starts to move. Where is the cause and where is the effect? You can't pinpoint them in time. You just have to say, well, I guess when this one hits this one starts moving. That's something Kant will say, that's something our brain is imposing on the world. Other things our mind impose on the world are time and space, and a lot of other things too. But basically, our mind is an active participant in our understanding of the world. And I think where Hayden White's Kantianism comes in is that our deployment and use of tropes is the way that our mind understands and relates to discourse. It's the way that we try to understand things. So it's the domains are a little bit different. Kant's talking about all of sensory experience, and he's talking about human conversations, human discourse. But still, when we take those, raw facts of history, or say, for example, we don't have access to those. But what we do have access to is our way of relating to them through a number of ways, and through organizing them with principles that we recognize as principles of history writing. Just to pick a genre. It doesn't have to be history. It could be a novel or whatever I said, any genre. But that our mind imposes those things. It uses tropes to understand. And I think if we can sort of see both as a mapping of one to the other, Kant, you have this sort of intangible noumena that we can't experience. The only thing we can experience is what our brain has processed and what has already become phenomena.
Mm-hmm.
And Hayden White will say, we don't have access to those raw facts. All we have is access to those processed facts, those discourse mediated facts. And how are they mediated? They're mediated through tropes. There you go. I think that is the essence of the introduction.
Right. It's let me just add a little bit of a paraphrase. I find it useful to talk about that historical movement from rationalism, empiricism, and Kant through the sources of error that they identified. So for a rationalist, the major source of error for us is perceptual illusions, like the senses deceive us. And for empiricists, this major source of error is our prejudice, are the ideas that don't have any correspondence to experience. Mm-hmm. And then with Kant, we identify a new source of error, which is not just an idea that doesn't correspond to experience, or an experience that is illusory, but a misidentification of something as something else, a category that is part of the structure of our consciousness, but then we project it as something in the world. Mm-hmm. The mishandling of our, yeah. So the noumena is that placeholder where we shouldn't identify our phenomena as more than what they are. We shouldn't let them speak on behalf of the noumena too much.
Yes. Yeah, because we don't even have access to them.
Right. All right. So maybe we can read that last paragraph, just last few sentences of the introduction, where he takes an anti-realist and rejects the anti-realism.
Let me add one more thing.
Sure.
So I did that whole thing about Kant just to sort of recapitulate why he thinks that he might have a defense of that accusation about there's no such thing as access to truth. What he's really saying is, and I think he says it right where you said at the end, I'll read it. Mm-hmm. I trust that the bulk of these essays will relieve me of those charges, the charges I just mentioned, at least in part. I have never denied that knowledge of history, culture, and society was possible. I have only denied that a scientific knowledge of the sort actually attained in the study of physical nature was possible. But I have tried to show that even if we can't achieve a properly scientific knowledge of human nature, we can achieve another kind of knowledge about it. The kind of knowledge which literature and art in general give us in easily recognizable examples. Mm-hmm. Only a willful, tyrannical intelligence could believe that the only kind of knowledge we can aspire to is that represented by the physical sciences. My aim here has been to show that we do not have to choose between art and science, that we cannot do so in practice. Not only that we don't have to, but that we can't do it. If we hope to continue to speak about culture as against nature, and moreover, speak about it in ways that are possible to all in various dimensions of our specifically human being.
Yeah,
that is
great.
I wish he wrote the whole book that way.
Mm.
He knows how to open an essay. He knows how to finish off an essay.
Yeah.
It's the middle part, Hayden, we need to work on. It's that middle 20 pages.
Right. Yeah, he really finished strong. I love that. I love that part about the willful, tyrannical intelligence that
Yes.
wants all sciences to be the same.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And how he italicizes human being.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was a lovely poetic touch too.
Mhm. He also returns to the idea of kind of hints at prefiguration. I wanted to mention that for him, rationality, our capacity for rationality and logic already prefigures in our so-called non-rational capacities. That's why the two are not opposite forces, that our rationality is opposite or has to overcome and eliminate our pre-rational or not rational sides, because it emerges out of them. Right, exactly.
Yes.
All right, I think that's good. Anything else? Yeah.
No, I think we covered everything pretty clearly. We should wrap this up. We'll post this on both of our channels. Yeah.
Sounds good.
And,
and next discussion will be, to which everybody's invited if they're interested in, the burden of history.
Yes, the burden of history, the first formal essay. I don't know whether I'll be able to do it next week. It might be the week after.
Sounds good.
I'm a bit busy, but no more than 2 weeks from today.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Thank you,
Thanks
John.
for tuning in, everyone. Take care. Bye.